But that brings us to the Finders cult, and you brought this to my attention. I had heard of the Finders cult, but I don't know a lot about them, so I might be deferring to you. But it is pretty interesting. On the surface, though, like everything I could find about the cult, besides the like incident about them we're going to talk about, they seemed exceptionally unremarkable. Like I couldn't find anything salacious or weird that they had really done. But then again, you can't find much about them asides the incident we'll get to. But what's your impression about the Finders cult's belief and practice, I guess?
Yeah, so I hadn't heard of the Finders either until I think there was that release from the FBI Twitter account, like declassified this like 600 pages of documents or something in like 2019, and that was like the first I had heard of it. So digging into it a little more, it almost is kind of the proto like I don't Jeffrey Epstein type I don't know organization where it's ostensibly maybe like a honeypot kind of blackmail organization. They may or may not be like abducting and trafficking children, or that's what is alleged, and that's what's also it's hard to separate what has actually been like confirmed about them versus what in the 600 page like leak or declassification, I guess, is just stuff that's like been written down by someone investigating somewhere along the line and like was never actually corroborated.
Yeah, so I guess that's how it's different than say like Jonestown, where like what's it, Jim Jones, what he was selling his audience was pretty well documented. He was like claiming miracles and advocating for like an egalitarian system. Like that's what was in it for the followers, but with the Finders,
Yeah, it's
that's
like there
not
really was
really
no
the focus
end
at
goal.
all.
It just seems like a bunch of like I kind of just hippies that were just like hanging out and just trying to like raise children free range. And I guess kind of
Yes.
like free them of the mental evils of modernity.
So they were more like Luddites.
In a way, that's all. That's what's strange too, is because there's this one aspect of it where it's very much like back to the land. And I don't know, so the incident that you were mentioning was that where the guys were like or stopped by an officer and they had like the kids in the van or something.
Yeah, so let's get into it. So in 1987, two men in suits were detained for child abuse because I believe they were in a park, like outside of a van. They had 6 kids with them who seemed mistreated. Yeah, I think they were like spotted in a park, but by the time the police found them, they were in a van. And the charges were eventually dropped. And this became like news, I guess, or it was like kind of talked about because there was a belief that the Finders were a CIA front organization, and the CIA demanded that the investigation be stopped into what these two men in suits were doing.
Exactly. I mean, in that way, similar to Epstein, in that in the past, any kind of investigations that were going on would hit a certain point and then just like be dropped, just because someone had requested that happen. And that's kind of like what gives it a lot of the ambiguity around it. It's similar to like Epstein again, is where you hear about it and you're like, well, that's crazy. There's no way this is like allowed to happen. This is just like some like online right wing crankery, and then he is eventually arrested and becomes not alive, and like give some credence to like, okay, well, I guess maybe there are rich people who do like weird shit like this. with the Finders, there isn't really as much of a connection to kind of like mainstream political figures. It seems like there is apparently a weird connection to like Patch Adams, like the actual guy who the movie was based on.
Yes.
Um, yeah, he I guess like was out at he would spend some time at the land they had in like Virginia or something. Also, not sure if it's related. Apparently, when Christopher Reeve like fell off that horse, he was apparently like nearby or on land owned by them. Um, but beyond that, I have no idea what connection may or may not exist there. But yeah,
Weird.
all anyone really has to go on is just that initial incident where there's like those arrests, or yeah, the interest by the police, and then it was dropped, and then this declassification of stuff that may or may not be true, like from 2 years ago.
Yeah, so do you know any specific real like I guess just interesting details from that leak, because I kind of looked into it and it's just really like slippery information. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's like nothing really seems to lead anywhere, and information in general is just very thin.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of threads that it's like not clear if they connect or where they do. I mean, some of the, I guess, kind of most salacious tidbits from that are there was, I guess, a couple like photographs that I think were described in the leak. I don't think the pictures were actually in them, but of like some of the children who were involved, and it was depicting this arguably like ritual sacrifice of a pair of goats. So the photo, I guess, was of the children like kind of bloodied and like in the process of dismembering the goats, and then I think one of them was like the female goat was pregnant, so they're after they'd killed the goat, they were then like removing the calf goat, baby goat, from the womb of the mother, and then like killing and skidding the father, or yeah, the guy goat. But the guy Petty, I think was his name, is kind of the main figurehead. Also referred to as the game caller, which is an extremely sus like nickname to have.
Yes.
That gives it the air of like an alternate reality game or something, but in an extremely old school way. But so his defense was like the kids doing this with the goat was, even though people they're doing satanic panic to it. They're saying that we're doing this like evil ritual sacrifice, but actually we were just teaching these kids about like killing and butchering animals, and this is where your food comes from, and it's a fact of life. And it's like on the one hand, there's some value, I guess, to having to like knowing there is this like violence and brutality that goes into meat production, that a lot of people I think just kind of compartmentalize. But to be standing around like robes and then making kids do it, and I think the way is alleged sounds odd. The other thing is the children were very much like they're raised in a kind of a Luddite way, very like back to the land, living rough. They're apparently only fed as a reward, so the kids were very like malnourished, and like bug bitten and stuff. Where the adults they tended to have like nicer cars. They were well dressed, as documented the news story about the police encounter. They're also very early users of technology. So this was like in the 70s and 80s. They like had telex machines that they would like drive around with in their cars that, again, allegedly would kind of tell them where to go. So that's ostensible. I don't know. That's like how the game caller would issue their next command. It kind of gave me the vibe of do you ever see the Black Mirror, where that kid is like getting directions on his cell phone, and he like has to drive around like London, and it culminates in him like having to kill a guy.
I have not. I've not watched Black Mirror.
Oh man. So I side note there, the first couple seasons of Black Mirror are great. It kind of falls off. I stopped really following it. But yeah, the first couple seasons are definitely worth watching. Very just kind of paranoiac about the, I don't know, techno hell we're like sort of living in. But yeah, to the Finders, that was kind of the strangest part that I had found, is just that even though the adults were like using very early internet technology, the kids are just being raised wild, essentially. So even if they were trying to go for like this communal living, like arrangement where, you know, the kids are just allowed to like live as free people, there's this like other side where the adults were just like not playing the same game that they're expecting the kids to play. So I don't. That's a strange part about it.
What I take from that is there is like a disparity. I mean, this is obvious, but a disparity between the adults and children, in the sense that like it doesn't seem like the adults in the group saw the children of the group growing up and taking their spot. Like it was more like the children were being
like
prepared
groomed,
for something. Yeah, they were being groomed, something like that.
Yeah, I mean that's, again, there's not really any solid evidence of any of it, but I think if you want to draw any conclusion from it, it would theoretically be that these are just children being raised to serve some kind of purpose, whether it is future like counterintelligence work or to act as a honeypot or something. I think as far as I've seen, the ones who like were or like known publicly seem to be living like fairly normal lives at this point. And I don't know if that's just because of like the attention that this cult eventually got, that they had to kind of spin down a couple of their assets, or if these people also just have some other secret life that, like, you know, they don't like talk about on social media. One of them, interestingly, I think they're fully separate people, but her name is Mary Houlihan, was one of the girls who was eventually, she like had some, was interviewed by the police and kind of depicted some of the like abusive behavior that they very much experienced. There's also this comedian named Mary Houlihan who, like, I don't think there's any relation. It's funny that they have the same name though. It's not the most common name. But also it's unclear like what their real names even are, or if these are just kind of assumed identities. But yeah, to the name of the cult, the Finders was the full kind of name of it, I guess, that I've heard is the Finders of Lost Children. So either, you know, people would join this group and kind of, in a way, almost like sacrifice their children to this, or they would just find lost kids, or to kind of the real like satanic panic aspect of it, just, you know, grabbing kids off the street and tossing them in a van or something.
Yeah, because what I was reading about these kids from that like 1987 incident is that, and again, it didn't become public until like 93, so the conspiracies about it come like several years after it happens, but it seems that the mothers of these kids, it took them a while to find them, and then when they were found, I think at least like one or two of the kids, if I'm remembering correctly, their mothers didn't want them anymore. So it does seem like they could have been like abandoned kids or kidnapped, or who knows? It's hard to say, but I guess I think we're getting towards the end. But before we go, I do want to hear, like, what if you had to guess what this group is for? What do you think is going on?
I mean, my kind of absolute, like, I don't know, most paranoid conspiratorial theory about it is that it is just kind of a human trafficking operation, I guess. Um, and again, impossible to say how much of that is that can be borne out. Also, a side note, I guess there's an odd connection to the McMartin case. Um, that like kind of daycare abuse scandal from Santa Monica, I want to say. There were apparently in that trove of documents that was like declassified. It contained somewhere in there a like blueprint of this daycare center with like where the claimed tunnels would have been. Um, so, I mean, who knows what the actual like connection there is, but yeah, if we had to come up with any kind of I don't know grand theory of what the purpose of this was, either to I don't know cultivate like ascended humans, like free of I don't know the pains of the modern world we live in, or to just I don't know cultivate assets for intelligence or human trafficking, or to I don't know sell to very rich people or something.
Yeah, because well, I remember with the McMartin Preschool trial, like that there was like allegations that there were secret tunnels beneath the school, and the like one other detail I always hear about it. Well, I heard about it a couple times, and it really stuck with me. Is that one of the victims at the preschool identified Chuck Norris as one of his abusers?
Wow, I didn't know that one.
Yeah. But it's also like they were alleging a lot of like kind of weird satanic panic type stuff, so it's very possible that they were kind of like coaxed into or felt pressured into saying certain things. But yeah, I mean, just little weird stuff like
Yeah,
that.
and that's really the question you get into with all of this is like how much of it is just kids trying to okay now like there's a cop talking to me, what do I say to them to make them happy, what do they want to hear, or how much of it was actually experienced, um, or is it all just a big like misunderstanding and elaborate hoax? Because that Marion Petty, again the figurehead, in interviews he was like, oh it was all just a misunderstanding. The pictures with like the goat was we were just trying to teach them about how where meat comes from. And I mean it rings of the like that Nebraska um, the Franklin credit scandal where like George H.W. Bush was like allegedly implicated, and kind of the final word on that was it was just a very elaborately constructed hoax. Um, which you wonder if that did happen today, and we have people were like on the internet. There was as much as to the degree that information is controlled, there is also this kind of there are nooks where you can find stuff. Um, if we would have known more about the Franklin scandal if it was happening in the present day, or this as well. But at this point, there is just so little to go on that all we can really do is just speculate about it.
Yeah, it is strange, and I'm glad I looked more into the Finders cult because it really is like I feel like there's a lot of stuff. People will be like, look up MK Ultra, and you won't learn everything about it, but you will find a vast treasure trove of information. But the Finders cult is really like in that kind of like X-Files realm where it's like there's more to learn. Like
Yeah,
we do not have a fraction of the story here.
yeah, and that's a lot of the research and like information that's been done. I feel like comes from like a small number of sources. Like a lot of what I found out was from this guy who his channel is called like We've Read the Documents. which I've heard this guy. I forget his name. I've heard him on like the Farm podcast, um, and like I'll see him on Twitter and stuff. I don't know. I find that name kind of like annoying. Like, I, however, he has read many documents, so I guess I can't fault him there. He also says supposedly instead of supposedly, which is like a weird pet peeve that if you just hear it over and over, you're like, man, I don't know how much this really helps credibility.
Supposedly.
Supposedly.
Oh, okay, yes.
But I mean, yeah, that's really the bulk of the research was like has come from kind of this one guy or just a couple like online, ostensibly like right wing cranks. So, like, is that shit coding? Is that just kind of the limited hangout of it? To where if people do look into it, they say, oh, there's like some internet weird shit, so I'll ignore it, and that just makes it easier to compartmentalize. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
a black hole. Also, since you mentioned Jim Jones, uh, we don't really have time today, but Black Hole of Guyana is a fascinating internet deep dive into what may or may not actually have happened with that cult.
Oh,
It
could
was
you give us a little taste of what they suggest?
It is alleged that the cult was kind of an MK Ultra program, um, and that's how much of that can we ever actually be sure of? Did the CIA just infiltrate the cult to like monitor it, or was it like from the top down an operation? Impossible to say at this point. So the other
Interesting.
juicy bits are, rather than the common story that people were, they were like dosed with the what is also not actually Kool-Aid. It was whatever, like generic brand fruit punch mix. It's
Mm-hmm.
alleged that people were actually like eliminated by like special forces. Um, as I don't know, I guess the cult became too like unruly or something and had to be liquidated, or they're like, well, we've learned whatever we needed to learn from this like research project, so we're gonna just retire it now. But yeah, there's a whole website from I forget the university. San Diego State University. Yeah, if you just Google Black Hole of Guyana, there's a very kind of bare bones page from sdsu.edu that gets into a lot of the I don't know theories and uncertainties around that cult.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking it up. There are quite a few books and stuff written about it, and people who actually worked in Washington D.C. have alleged the same thing. So very interesting. We could talk about that another time.